Good morning. It's time for our next chapter in Goat in the Garden. As you know, the last time they found Houdini, they treated him because he had eaten a rhododendron, which is poisonous to goats, and he is back home with Lydia on her farm. So, chapter 6, all we see is a hammer and some nails. Let's see what happens. Mandy was working in the residential unit at Animal Ark on what she had to admit were the everyday chores. She was cleaning cages and mopping floors, but she kept her mind active with visions of springtime up on High Cross. For now, Mandy had a mission. In their own mind, she and James called it Save High Cross Farm. She knew that the supply of fresh fruit and vegetables was only the first step of many. She swore to herself that nothing would get in the way of saving Lydia and the goats from spending another terrible winter like the one just passed. And she swore too that Sam Western would never again get Houdini into his clutches. Ooh, remember Mr. Western was the one that put the rhododendron branch where Houdini could eat it, and then that's what made Houdini sick. The goats were now allowed out into a field by day and taken into the barn at night. The sight of the three kids, now approaching a year old, was a delight. Monty was especially a frisky, agile, naughty little thing. He dueled with his hornless head and danced up close whenever anyone went near with a carrot or an apple from the supermarket supply. Remember in the last one, Mandy and James went to the supermarket and they got late day fruits and vegetables to be fed to the goats. So they're helping Miss Lydia out by providing food for the goats. Lydia was forever hammering new stakes into the hard earth to make fence posts for the wire fencing, but the young goat was forever finding new ways of defeating her. He seemed to have a magic sixth sense for a weak spot in the fence, and he would charge at it head down until he battered it low enough to climb over. Then Lydia would be out in the lane after him, talking and coaxing him back into the field with a choice stick of celery before he had time to hightail it down to the hall. She had to have eyes in the back of her head. My mom used to tell me that she had eyes in the back of her head. That means they can see you whatever you're doing. A penny for your thoughts, Dr. Adam asked. He'd taken his white coat down from the peg, ready to begin the day at the clinic. They're not worth it, said Mandy. I'm just daydreaming. He smiled. Why don't you go off and get some fresh air? I'll get Simon to finish here. But Mandy didn't like to give up on a job. She got the mop and poured disinfectant into a bucket of steaming water. What would make an ideal fence to keep goats secure, Dad? She swished the polished floor with water, one section at a time. Ah, goats. Dr. Adam took a miserable looking hamster from its cage and gently turned it face up in the palm of his hand. He examined its abdomen for swelling. I might have known. There was another long pause. Chain link, I suppose. What's that? The kind of fence they use to keep soccer balls from flying off the field. They use it around tennis courts. It's tough and it lasts. He put the hamster gently back in her cage. Even Houdini couldn't escape a field fenced in with that. It would have to be high, 9 or 10 feet. Is it expensive? Her father nodded. Too expensive for Lydia, if that's what you're thinking. Mandy admitted it. She stood up straight and ran her fingers nervously through her short blonde hair. I'm worried about Mr. Western. He keeps telling people that Lydia's goats have ruined his garden. It's not even true. Houdini may have paid him a couple of visits, but you can't say that he's ruined anything. I agree, Dr. Adams said. There's no need to get excited. But there was. Mr. Western tried to do away with Houdini with that terrible rhododendron. He made Dennis Seville feed it to Houdini. I know he did. And the next time, they'll succeed. Mandy resumed mopping the floor savagely now. We have to keep Houdini away from there, and the young ones. There's one called Bonnie who's nearly good at escaping as Houdini. Her father listened as he worked. "You'll think of something," he said. "You always do." "What we need is a good, strong fence all around the small top meadow and someone to put it up." In fact, finding fencing for the meadow proved very difficult indeed. Mandy called garden centers and builders all around Wilford and Walton, checking prices. "You'd need to be a millionaire," she thought. She put down the phone and finally gave up. It was just too expensive to consider. The date of the spring fair, a high point in the Welford year, was rapidly approaching. Her father was pretty fit for the race, but still, Mandy thought she might drag him out on another training run to try and take her mind off fences. They took the normal route out of Welford up toward the beacon. "Keep going, Dad. 6 minutes, 30 seconds, Mandy encouraged, shouting from her bicycle. They drew level with the dreaded Upper Welford Hall. The garden preened itself in the sunshine. Thousands of daffodils waved in the breeze like a golden sea. Green shoots sprouted on the hedges. Dr. Adam wheeled himself to the top of the hill, but Beacon House was his limit. He collapsed on a grassy bank outside the gates. "Give me 5 minutes," he gasped. Dr. Adam was so tired. Mandy left her bicycle and strolled off, still thinking, Lydia, fencing, goats, Lydia. Like a chant inside her head, she couldn't get rid of the problem of the fencing, and it appeared like magic, as if she'd willed it. There, inside the vast garden of the Beacon House, was the Parker Smith tennis court, and there, by brilliant coincidence, was just the fence. Two workmen, busy resurfacing the court with an expensive all-weather surface, had dismantled the old chain-link fence. It lay in giant rolls beside brand-new shiny rolls of the stuff. Mandy stood dumbstruck, her mind in a whirl. "Hi!" she shouted to the workmen. They stopped work and strolled over. "What are you going to do with all that old wire fencing?" One man scratched his chin. The other man opened a can of soda and drank great swigs. "Scrap it," the first one answered. "Why?" Mandy's heart raced. As usual, she came straight to the point. "Could I have it, please?" The corners of his mouth went down, and he shrugged. "It's not ours to give." "Anyway, how would you move it?" the other man asked. Mandy hadn't thought of that. "You'll need a truck the size of ours, at least." The second younger man walked off, unwilling to waste any more time. But the older man stood with dark, wavy hair, a big nose, and a red face. He considered the problem. "Supposing you could move it, what's it for?" he asked. "To keep goats fenced in." Mandy leaped at the chance to explain. She told him about Houdini and young Monty. "Good idea," he agreed. "This would be just the right stuff." But he scratched his stubbly chin again. "The missus is out at the moment. She's the one to ask. She's the boss." Mandy knew this was true. Mrs. Parker Smith ran the place like an empress in her golden slippers and bracelets. "Come back later," the man suggested. "There's no harm in asking." Mandy nodded. She needed a bit of time to plan. Her dad was up on his feet, limbering up for phase 2 of his job. What time will she be back? "Well, she went to pick up the little girl from riding. I don't expect she'll be long." Mandy thanked him and sprinted back to her father. "You look pleased with yourself," Dr. Adams said, back in his stride along Mandy's bike. "Yup," she grinned. Fate meant her to have that fence. "You'd need someone to put it up," James pointed out. They'd met in McFarland's store buying potato chips. She sighed. "Why does everyone always have to be so practical? First of all, the workman says I'll need a truck to carry it. Secondly, you tell me I'll need someone to put it in place. Why don't you say, 'Brilliant, great, let's go for it'?" "Because you do need someone to do the work," James persisted. "It's logical." They walked out to the main street, munching chips. Mandy sighed. But he was right. They couldn't manage this themselves. They crossed the courtyard in front of Fox and Goose. But we can't just drop the idea because there's a few problems, she protested. It's a good idea, that's for sure. James walked alongside. But who do we know who can put up fences? And who has the time? Who knows Lydia well enough to want to help? No one, Mandy admitted. They wove through the parked cars in the tavern parking lot, slowing their pace as the problems of the fence seemed to grow. Still, Mandy refused to be put off. When there were animals in need, she never gave in. "Hello there," said a deep voice, stopping them in their tracks. "Ernie!" they said in chorus. Ernie Bell was a stubborn old man who loved animals. Though he didn't like to show it, he and Mandy were firm friends. "How's the kitten?" Mandy asked. "How's Sammy?" James added. Sammy was an orphan squirrel adopted by Ernie. "Great," Ernie said with a smile. He beckoned them over to the little street of cottages beyond the parking lot. "Come over and have a look." He took pleasure in showing them a sleek, proud Twinkie and a chatterbox squirrel scampering in his custom-built run in the backyard. Mandy always took special interest in Twinkie. She bent to stroke her. The cat wound herself around Mandy's ankles. "So here's Mandy and James, and they're talking to Mr. Ernie. He's an animal lover. Do you think that they'll ask him for help?" "That's a great run you built for Sammy," James said in a very loud, slow voice. Mandy's mouth fell open. "I mean, you must be pretty good with wood and wire fencing and stuff to build something as strong as that," James continued. He gave Mandy a long, significant look. "Ought to be," Ernie said, gruff but flattered. "I used to be a carpenter once upon a time, ran my own little business." "But you kept your tools and things?" James bent to tickle Sammy's nose through the fence. "He's very friendly," he said with a grin. "Just looking for a handout," Ernie grumbled. "Here, give him a peanut." He handed a few nuts to James and watched the squirrel take the treat. "Ernie!" Mandy said brightly. She took over from James. "What a brilliant idea," she thought. "I bet you're the best carpenter for miles around." Ernie blew out his cheeks and gave a little huh sound. "Flattery," he said scornfully. "What's behind it?" "Ernie," she said again, sounding shocked at this. "It happens to be true. Why should anything be behind it?" "Yes, but it is," Ernie said flatly. "I know when someone's about to ask a favor." Mandy sighed. "Oh, well, if you don't want to help." She knew from experience that Ernie would always do the opposite of whatever you expected him to do. "I never said that," he protested. He looked sideways at Mandy. "I never said I wouldn't help." "Oh, but you wouldn't want to be bothered. It's a long way out of the village, up by the beacon. It'd be too much trouble." Ernie stood in his little garden, feet wide apart, hands in his trouser pockets. "Who says it'd be too much trouble?" He looked stubborn and grumpy. "Oh, it's just Lydia Fawcett up at High Cross. That's all." Mandy risked a quick glance at James. He was nodding in support. "I know the place," Ernie said. "Old Frank Fawcett ran a tidy farm, but he was a touch old-fashioned, I hear. Not a regular down in the village." "I know, and his daughter's just the same. She's probably not your sort either. She keeps to herself." Mandy crossed her fingers behind her back. "Oh, I don't mind that," Ernie objected. "I'm the sort to mind my own business, too." Mandy nodded. Then she took a deep breath. "She needs a new fence installed, that's all, but I'm sure you wouldn't be interested." "New fence? Oh, it would be a lot of work," she said. "Wouldn't it, James?" "I expect it would be more than one person could handle anyway, and she's got no money to pay for the work." James agreed. "No, we shouldn't have said anything." "Right." Ernie snapped his fingers. "If she wants a fence put up, tell her I'm her man." "Oh, no, Ernie," they protested. "Yep, I can do with fresh air and exercise," he said, heading indoors, "and I like a bit of a challenge, or I get rusty. When does she want me to start?" "Tomorrow," Mandy said, swallowing hard. Sometimes you had to take a risk. "8 o'clock sharp," Ernie said. "It's Sunday tomorrow," James pointed out. "Yup, 8 o'clock on Sundays. Otherwise, it'd be 7." And Ernie closed the door firmly in their faces. Mandy and James rode off, delirious with success. "Now all we have to do is get our fence," Mandy cried. "Oh, no, I don't think so," Miss Parker Smith said through thin, shiny pink lips. "That doesn't sound like a good idea at all." Mandy's heart sank, but with James standing alongside her, she gained a bit more courage. "Lydia really does need better fencing for the goats, and we thought if you didn't need this old stuff, it would be really useful for her." Miss Parker Smith stood in the doorway, backed by the white marble splendor of her hall. Imogen Parker Smith peeped out from behind her mother, black riding hat still strapped firmly on her chubby head. "I'm afraid that woman is something of a nuisance in the neighborhood," she said coolly. Mandy struggled to swallow a lively defense of Lydia. How could they call her a nuisance? Anger nearly choked her. She can't really expect any favors under the circumstances. Imogen smirked. Mandy turned very red in the face. "Lydia doesn't even know we're asking," James explained. "It was our idea. We just saw the old fencing ourselves." But his voice was fading at the set look on Miss Parker Smith's face. "Well, I'm sorry," she rolled on, "but I think she may be pulling the wool over your eyes, and you'll understand if I have to say no." Mandy swallowed her disappointment. "I'm sure our neighbor, Mr. Western, wouldn't thank us for offering charity to the woman on the hill, as he calls her. In fact, he'd probably never speak to us again." She laughed in a high, unfunny laugh and began to close the door on them. "In any case, my husband isn't here, and we'd need time to discuss this sort of thing with him." Just then, Mr. Parker Smith's black sports car entered between the electronic gates and swept up the driveway. He gave the workman a wave and pulled up at the front door. He got out, then bent to hug Imogen as she ran out and clambered over him in full riding gear. "Hello, pet," he said, and even Imogen looked like a normal, unspoiled child, glad to see her dad. "Hello," he said to Mandy and James. "Oh, darling," his wife said, "I was just trying to explain." She pecked him on the cheek. "I'm saying we just can't hand over the old fencing from the tennis court. I mean, it's not as simple as that." "Oh?" Mr. Parker Smith looked with renewed interest at Mandy. "What on earth do you want with our old fencing?" "To put up good fencing for the goats up at High Cross," Mandy exclaimed. She immediately fired up in defense of Lydia. "She may not have money, but she's a good farmer, and she works and works all by herself up at that farm with no one to help. She keeps fantastic goats. They're the most beautiful creatures you can imagine, and it's all because of Lydia." Mr. Parker Smith frowned. He looked quite frightening in this serious, unsmiling mood. He was the sort who never got excited or involved, Mandy decided. She didn't think he'd say yes where his wife had said no, but at least she'd make a really good try. "Sam Western says the woman and her goats are a terrible nuisance. They keep ruining his flowers," Miss Parker Smith reminded him. "The neighborhood would be better off without her and her hideous creatures." She stood and stared at Mandy, tapping her pink fingernails against the door frame. "Hmm." Mr. Park Smith looked irritated, but at what? Who was here first? That's the question I'd like to ask. "Pardon?" Miss Parker Smith's voice went high and brittle. "I mean, I'm sure Lydia Fawcett and her family have been farming at High Cross longer than Sam Western and his family machines at the hall." "She has," Mandy said, utterly amazed. "Well, Sam Western had better keep quiet about the tone of the neighborhood and such nonsense," Mr. Parker Smith said fiercely. His wife began to crumple. Listen, he told her, we live here in this beautiful house, but we haven't always had such a good life. You know that. He was really annoyed. Then he pulled himself together. Look, he said, I've had a long day. I'm sorry. Mr. Parker Smith walked over to the workmen. Break for half an hour, he told them. Load up the old fencing into the truck and drive it up to the farm, would you? These kids will show you the way. Mandy couldn't believe her ears. The friendly workman gave her thumbs up. Thank you, she gasped. She knew there was no need to say any more. Mr. Parker Smith nodded and smiled. I'm glad to be able to help, he said. Very glad. You can tell Lydia Fawcett that I'm pleased to be able to help a good neighbor. In fact, tell her I'll stop by myself to say so. And he went inside, followed by his wife and daughter. He'd had the last word. It was settled. Yes! Mandy and James yelled with delight. They ran over to the truck. Up went the rolls of wire fencing. Off went the truck along the bumpy lane. Lydia came to the door with a look of complete surprise. Don't say anything, Mandy warned as they pulled up at the gate. She was out in the yard in her boots and brown jacket, peering up at the fencing. I'll explain later. And Lydia watched in disbelief as the men unloaded the great rolls of fencing into her yard. It wasn't until the next morning that Lydia was really convinced this was her fence, even though it had been sitting in the yard all night waiting for Ernie Bell. When he arrived, he measured it and found that it would go right around the small top meadow. It was about 8 feet high. Ernie explained to Lydia that he was there to trim wooden stakes and drive them into the ground. Then he would nail the wire fencing to the posts. No goat would ever be able to escape from one of his fences, and it wouldn't cost her a penny. Mandy's plan was working out perfectly. She went around all day with a huge smile. Lydia was speechless. She came out and milked the goats, eyeing Ernie with double suspicion. She tramped silently along in her old boots. Not over friendly, is she? Ernie commented. Mandy laughed. She is when she gets to know you. She knew Lydia always made a bad first impression. Well, it's nothing to me whether she's on speaking terms, Ernie grumbled. He worked neatly and quickly. No one could make a better job of a fence than Ernie Bell. Lydia came out again to offer a cup of tea. Milk and 2 sugars, Ernie muttered. You'll have to do without saucers, Lydia said firmly. I won't bring my best cups out here to get chipped for anybody. But Mandy knew she was weakening. Before Ernie left, she might even offer him a smile. And when the fence was up, tall and straight, Lydia went into the barn to fetch Houdini. He came trotting out, sniffing the fresh air, looking for a place to escape. But he stopped short. He pawed the grass. Lydia had led him into the middle of the new compound. All around the fencing towered. Houdini turned his head in full circle. He looked at Lydia. He looked at the fence. He measured his distance, head down, ready to charge. Houdini, Lydia said sternly, and he thought better of it. The clever goat saw that this fence was like no other. It was unbreakable. So he lifted his head, turned haughtily, and strode off to the top of the meadow. Perhaps I stay, perhaps I won't, he seemed to say. He took a delicate nibble of a fresh dandelion leaf. Ernie, Lydia, and Mandy stood and watched. Well, I reckon we won that battle, Ernie said. But maybe not the war, Lydia warned as they went through the tall gate. They left Houdini safely fenced in, for the moment at least. Wow, isn't Mandy awesome that she could do all this and just figure out how to help Lydia, and she got the fencing, and not only the fencing, but she found Mr. Ernie who was willing to put it up, and none of it cost Lydia anything. That's a great thing for a friend to do for another, help their friends out. Maybe it will keep Houdini in his place. You'll have to join in the next time to see what happens. And chapter 7, wow, it doesn't give us much of a hint. All it shows us is a crate. So if you join in next time, we'll find out what happens in Goat in the Garden.